Hello, everyone, to this talk to be given by Dr. Pamela Steiner. The talk is co-sponsored by the Society for Armenian Studies and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. We've been looking forward to this talk for about a few months as we were writing back and forth with Dr. Steiner about an appropriate date. The title of the talk tonight is Good Enough Healing, Collective Trauma History and How to Learn from It. And the talk is based on Dr. Steiner's Collective Trauma and Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations since 1839. The book was published by Hart of Bloomsbury Press in 2021. I'm going to provide a short introduction to Dr. Steiner's biography, and then she's going to take over and give us the more important aspects of the book. Dr. Steiner is a senior fellow at the FXB Center of Health and Human Rights, Peachon School of Public Health, Harvard University. Over the last 17 years, her work at FXB has been to contribute to improving relationships among Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis. In these years, activities have included Track 2 workshop for Armenian and Turkish participants and a large public meeting with Hassan Jamal, grandson of one of the architects of the Armenian Genocide and author of the Turkish bestseller, 1915, The Armenian Genocide. Her work entailed immense learning about these relationships. Her lessons taken about what is needed to achieve something positive among Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis is pulled together in her recent interdisciplinary book, Collective Trauma and the Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations since 1839. As I said, published by Hart in 2021. Steiner has also facilitated workshops with German and Jews and Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. During these years, Steiner continued to practice psychotherapy, focusing most on work with traumatized individuals. Dr. Steiner holds a PhD in developmental psychology and an MED in counseling and consulting psychology from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and an MA in government from Harvard University, and a BA in philosophy from Smith College. Her doctoral dissertation focused on developmental of the adult decision-making mind, School of Education, while working on leadership Kennedy School and Track 2 conflict resolution in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She was co-founder of the program on international conflict analysis and resolution at Harvard's Weatherhead Center of International Affairs between the years 1995 to 2003. For 12 years before that, she was a clinical instructor in psychology and at Cambridge Hospital, Harvard Medical School. She is certified both in group psychotherapy and a new approach to trauma healing, somatic experiencing. Ted Bogosian, the prominent Emmy-winning filmmaker, when he read her book, actually commented, your supreme meaningful book is rocking my world, end quote. Welcome, Dr. Steiner, for the this event co-sponsored by the Society of Armenian Studies and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. And for everyone, if you have any questions, please write in the chat section after the event. Meanwhile, the floor is yours, Dr. Steiner. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Bedros. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you also, and Mark, and Katerina for enabling me to be here tonight. This is a very important, welcome opportunity for me to present my views, and I'm very interested in any reactions. Now, as you mentioned, it was indeed 17 years ago that Roger Hagopian, who's very closely connected with NAASR, was in my home. Roger is not only a filmmaker, but also a rug cleaner, and of course, an Armenian American. And when he was in my home, this is how I got into this work with the Armenian situation. When Roger was in my home, he saw a photograph of my great-grandfather, Henry Morgenthau Sr., and he and I began to talk about it. As the Armenians here know well, my great-grandfather was the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire just from 1913 until the early 1916, which means he saw the beginning of the genocide. He did try unsuccessfully completely to stop it happening. He reported it to the US government and to other people worldwide. So Roger and I talked about him. We talked about my work in conflict resolution that Bedros has mentioned. And Roger suggested I get myself over to NAASR, which is in the next town to where I live. And I did that. And I joined NAASR and thereafter attended loads and loads of lectures there and elsewhere. I got very, very interested and involved. I went to conferences all over the place. I gave talks myself. And my association with NAASR included about 15 years ago a wonderful trip sponsored by NAASR, headed by George Bornutian, the historian, and with about 15 or 20 Armenians and myself, and we traveled to Eastern Turkey and to Yerevan, and it was a very important learning experience and a wonderful trip for me. Then I began my work in the conflict resolution area, holding workshops for Armenians and Turks, and eventually went to Istanbul, met Hassan Jamal, the grandson of Jamal Pasha, invited him to Harvard to talk. That was a big open workshop, and I think quite a successful one, and a very good potential pilot learning thing for other purposes. So I went again to Armenia, this time on my own for the 100th commemoration of the start of the Armenian Genocide. I did that in 2015. While I was there, I also traveled, thanks to the good offices of Anna Ohanian. I got to go to Karabakh and had a very fascinating time there. So shortly, well, I had already started to write the book. The book took me about 10 years to write, which is much more than I ever thought it was going to take me. But I was silly to begin to think I could do it in anything less than that. I could have kept going. There was plenty more to explore, but I did put 10 very solid years into it. And I want to here acknowledge the immense help I got from Armin Manuk Khaloyan, who's a young Armenian American historian, and his help was immeasurable. Now, throughout writing the book, I had three sources of very important inspiration and intimidation, which was like, and these three were like an internal engine propelling me to keep at it and write the best book I possibly could. And one of them was my great-grandfather's presence in my mind, and that was there all the time. I certainly wanted to write a book he would be proud of. And the other one was my wonderful education. I've had a lot of education, and it was all spectacularly helpful. And then finally, the quality of Armenian scholarship that I managed to expose myself to. All of those really impelled me all the time. They were always in my head. So as you may or may not be able to hear, it in these 17 years, the Armenian-Turkish relationship especially became the center of my work life. Now, that is not at all surprising, because I'm going to quote my mentor at Harvard who taught me conflict resolution work, who is Herb Kelman, who died a few months ago, but a very important person who spent at least 40 years attempting to bring Israeli Palestinians and Israeli Jews and other Palestinians together. And he wrote, "Ethnic struggles become an inescapable part of daily life. The conflict pervades the whole society, not only when it takes the form of explicit violence, but even when the violence is muted. Thus, analysis of the conflict requires attention not only to its strategic, military, and diplomatic dimensions, but also to its economic, psychological, cultural, and social structural dimensions. Now, meeting all the people I have met through these 17 years and traveling to places entirely new to me, I hadn't heard of them, even a lot of them, and learning so much of the history has been profound, it's been enjoyable, it's been disturbing, it's been very saddening, it's been very painful at times, it's been very maddening, it's been upsetting, and even embarrassing. I felt that some of these last feelings happened when those who found what I said wrong or misleading or offensive let me know that. And however, I would say that every bit of it has taught me a huge amount and greatly deepened my understanding. And I'm very grateful for all of it. What I won't do today is to offer thoughts on substantive policy. Rather, I speak as an expert for both individuals and groups on processes they can gain and use in terms of psychological understanding of their own and others' inner individual and collective processes. My lens can be used in many other, except for other than the Armenian, Turkish, Azerbaijani contexts, because it looks at the deepest motivations and dynamics of parties in conflict, and even more important, the conflicts within an individual single party. So next slide, please, Bedros. Thank you. This talk is based, as Bedros said, on my book. It's a result of my search for the psychological essence of fostering social change. Now, right away, I'm going to modify that statement because much of my talk today is and can only be based on parts of my book, the parts that I think will be least familiar to people here. More than half of my book, which I will not explore here, although I'd love to do it, is history told through the lens of collective trauma. But what I will say is based on parts of the book as well as other research and practice, and some of that is in the book and some of it not. But all of it is material that follows from the book and from what I've learned since the book was published and what I've thought about, and completes the message I very much want to offer here. Next slide, please. Proposition 1. Like the histories of many individual trauma survivors, human history rhymes or repeats. That's very important to the whole talk. Like the histories of many individual trauma survivors, human history, collective history, rhymes or repeats. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Given that truth, which I think it is, could, I ask, repetitive, traumatizing conflicts between peoples be interrupted and healing begun, if only in part and only a start, but still importantly, by placing them in a new perspective, that of the human compulsion to repeat. Now, the word trauma and words related to it like traumatic and traumatizing refer to an overwhelming harmful event, or it refers to the serious threat of such an event. It refers equally to the threat and always to the subjective experience of either the event or threat. Next, please. In essence, trauma is imposed power or a serious threat of imposed power. That is, unwanted or hurtful power. So a traumatic situation occurs when a greater power of any kind threatens to overpower an insufficiently defended lesser power. A traumatically threatened or traumatized party may gain power and perpetrate. Collective traumas all entail significant losses or threats of such losses, material or psychological losses and threats. Complex and collective traumas also entail complex effects on groups, cultures, and institutions. At the same time, collective traumas do affect different groups differently. The same trauma, Black and white, rich and poor, Russians and Ukrainians, climate refugees, those unaffected by the climate event. A significant factor is the power that any group or subgroup possesses and is willing to use in the situation. In response to a traumatic event or situation, members of the same group will differ, but they all react and respond. But frequently the difference is in degree and in actions taken. For some people, for example, the intensity of the memories fades, but maybe for them, most of the time, it fades, but only while they're awake, only then to return in nightmares. Collective traumas are often entangled with structural, political, and moral issues, whereas individual traumas may not be. But however entangled they may be, the compulsion to repeat or rhyme with history is attributable to how our brains work in response to traumatic threat. The compulsion to repeat or rhyme with history is attributable to how our brains work in response to traumatic threat. Experiencing a traumatic threat or event, our brains respond almost entirely voluntarily, as well as momentarily, in one of three ways. Fighting, I call it fight, and it's called that. Fleeing or flight, you've all heard of fight and flee, or fight and flight. And freezing, which you may not have heard of, which is being immobilized and is called freeze. Now, post-trauma development of symptoms is common, and they are of many kinds and bear the involuntary impulses of fight, flight, or freeze. For example, when we remember traumatic experience, we can learn to communicate our subjective memories in terms of emotions, thoughts, and body sensations, those three. Whether we went into fight, whether we went into flight, or whether we went into freeze, all of those things are remembered in terms of emotions, thoughts, and body sensations. So if we say my body was frozen in terror, we convey body sensations of coolness, which is what happens, and immobility. We're frozen in terror. Other examples of body sensations include feeling rigid, tight, loose, open, heavy or light, fuzzy or clear, a surging impulse to strike or run or hide versus stillness, limp, nauseous, as if choking or suffocating, etc. As we gain awareness of and make the connections between the three dimensions of the traumatic experience, emotions, thoughts, and body sensations, we are processing the experience. We are making meaning, making a narrative out of the experience, eventually, with more and more of our experience, a larger, full narrative for ourselves. Such processing enables healing. As that happens, it also enables deliberation, which is essential and useful in meaningful or helpful policy making or conflict resolution work. Proposition 2. So I want to illustrate what I've just said, actually. Sorry, I want to go back to the last one. I want to illustrate this with the title of a book by Avraham Berg, who was the ex-speaker of the Knesset. And by the way, I'm purposely not using Armenian, Turkish, or Azerbaijani examples right now because I want to help us all get distance from what I'm presenting. So I'm using the title of the book by Avraham Berg, as I said, who was the speaker of the Israeli Knesset. And the book is called The Holocaust is Over. We Must Rise from Its Ashes. It was written about 10 years ago. Now, the words in the title reflect the impulse of freeze. We must rise from the ashes, that the people are stuck in the ashes. And the body's sensation is reflected of frozenness and stuckness in the ashes. And then the words, we must rise from the ashes, also convey the emotion of despair. The first words of the title, The Holocaust is Over, is a fact, a thought. So it's thought, body sensations, and emotions. This is a fact, a thought. The Holocaust is over. And the second thought, and the second thought, he says, is a deliberative one. It's a recommendation. It's a call to action. We must rise from the ashes. Next slide, please. Proposition 2. Our involuntary responses often swamp or flood our minds, accounting significantly for the disablement of our deliberative capacities, such as questioning our assumptions and being open to considering something unfamiliar. Next slide. Let's suppose the members of a group are fearful in the face of a threat and respond with fight, flight, or freeze. Whichever response it is, fight, flight, or freeze, takes over and impedes the best functioning of the collective to make a full thought response. Choices are then made either by flight, such as by unrealistic, fantastical, wishful thinking, and or by fight, power dynamics, or freeze, the loss of one's mind, rather than by careful deliberation to ensure the greatest possibility of achieving core purpose and values. Now, I want to give an example of frozenness of an actual an Armenian individual, and that was the composer Vardapat Komitas. And this is a quotation from, I'm pretty sure it was Peter Balakian's book on his great uncle. It said, the highly placed friends persuaded Talat, the head of the government, to arrange for Komitas's return to Istanbul, where an observer, and Komitas had been deported the beginning of the first day of the genocide. And he was a very sensitive man, and he lost his mind quite soon. And when he was returned to Istanbul, which was in itself an amazing event, really, that Talat returned him there, but he was pressured by other people. An observer later reported seeing Komitas frozen. This is a quote, frozen, he could not move. So this happens, and I'm afraid that this man pretty much stayed that way for his life. And today on NPR, Bill McKibben I heard him talking about an editorial he published just today on all the problems we're not addressing in this country right now, from guns to female rights to control their bodies and so on. And the title of McKibben's op-ed is Stuck. So that's a frozenness of our whole society at this point. We're not responding in a healthy way. So thus, traumatic threat compels us via these hardwired fight, flight, or freeze responses to strike back, to run, or hide. And that's the way the whole population of, oh God, I can't think of it right now. So afterwards, when we're triggered or threatened another time, we are still hardwired. First, if we can, to strike back, to take revenge. If not, then we're impelled to flee or freeze. Thus, this is the conclusion now of this first discussion of that first proposition. Thus do the involuntary compelled neuromechanics of trauma set up history
Pam, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Pam.
Holly.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, so sorry. Well, people could read that. What if leaders were to notice the triggers with empathy whenever needed, and then spoke to people's feelings and thereafter to the complex situation in an intelligible way? People might be able to hear better and consider more, because it would validate the anxiety and underscore the necessity of deliberating and inviting multiple views. And I'm going to explain that more. And if leaders were to do that, it could be an alternative to manipulating the feelings of the group in order to whip them up or to stop them from thinking, which is what we get so much of the time. And that's about this country just as much, as I think I've made clear. Next slide, please. Proposition 3, collectively naming, explaining, and processing certain situations as collective trauma could therefore jumpstart and interrupt the human compulsion for repeating history and promoting such healing as could take place. So that collective naming, explaining, and processing would have to be done by an authority. Next. Proposition 4. Substantial research shows that more than half of adults unselfconsciously, and most other adults purposefully, speak and act in conformity with what for them is established authority in their identity groups, whether that authority be in the form of persons, work role definition, cultural expectations, traditions, or written documents with authority in those groups. And traumatic threat exaggerates that tendency. To avoid repetition, as discussed, and to achieve deliberateness in the face of difficult problems, difficult threats, impossible situations, requires openly questioning. If we want to do better than we've done in the past, we must openly question our usual pre-learned responses, which so often merely demonstrate our agreement or niceness with those identity groups. Thus, in addition to unprocessed trauma, conformity motivation is another major factor, disabling deliberative consideration of long-stuck problems. So what does this conformity motivation look like? A group member's overriding motivation to manifest loyalty or protect their identity groups or their own standing or niceness in them, for example, shows up in indiscriminate projection of the past onto the present, selective remembering, such as cherry picking to deceive, avoidance of responsibility by only blaming others and not questioning ourselves, and denying facts, lying, justifying wrongdoing, closed-mindedness, no imagination, we had no choice, there's no reconsidering of counter history, what we might have done, and concealment of shame and humiliation. And I review all of those instances. I mean, I acquired my awareness of them through the history I wrote about in my book. So there are 2 chapters, one on what it was like, what it is like today to be Armenians, what it is like today to be Turks with their very different histories. And those strategies show up in very different ways, and not all of them in each group, but all of those strategies are there. And in my opinion, all of these strategies avoid the full reality of situations by not dealing deliberately with other perspectives for the reasons I've given. And therefore, these strategies are a form of flight. Proposition 5. We are right now at a great turning point in both group relational and ecological history. Being so much compelled by trauma and motivated by loyalty, conformity is no longer viable. if we're going to make it. Proposition 6, if less compelled by trauma, because we'll always be partly compelled by it, and freer from motivation to conform to authority, we can have a hope of acting deliberately. Acting deliberately, however, is not hardwired, not instinctual, not automatic, and not involuntary. By processing trauma, by beginning thereby to heal, and I described how processing works, and evaluating conformity responses, evaluating them because there's always a lot of value in them. We gain access to our developed higher capacities for new learning and deliberation. Acting deliberately does include making mistakes, admitting not knowing, and being uncomfortable or embarrassed. But there's so much not yet mentioned here that's working against the difficulties of facing this serious moment. Even if we speak and act deliberately, how on earth in time can destructive, repetitive patterns possibly be interrupted when the powerful funders of so many politicians who determine policy seem to lack the political will needed, and when legal norms often do not deter and are unenforced, both national and international, and when in certain conflicts there is such an enormous power imbalance between parties, and when structures support the powerful, as in structural racism. And finally, when the less powerful often have very little to protect themselves. Proposition 7. For decades, psychotherapeutic processes have actually transformed and revolutionized our individuals' lives. Recently developed societal level processes suggest the possibility of a similar revolutionary transformation, but they need pilot programs like the one I described with Hassan Jamal, especially in scale. That had 200 people at it, and that was much bigger than the prior work that we've done, and also depth. However, collective trauma had never been addressed in those earlier processes, the ones I call hopeful new processes. And that would offer the depth I think that's needed. But also, I'm afraid not included ever is the role of power structures fueling the feedback loops between them and politicians and the lobbies between the politicians, sorry, that's a mistake, that word and, between politicians and the lobbies of many industrial complexes worldwide, the arms, guns, fossil fuel, incarceration in this country anyway, food, drug, media, and technology. Next, Proposition 8. All of us need to hold individuals responsible in these industrial complexes. We must address them in large-scale processes, including trauma healing and also deliberative processes, and pressure them into acting responsibly. Next, please. Some ways we can all just begin to start processing collective traumas, gain deep awareness of our own experience of collective trauma, and plan with another, don't do it alone, to share it within our work groups. Acquire deep understanding, strategic empathy of others and of others, the opposite other, starting with ourselves. Include discussions on this in public with many people. Processing collective trauma, in other words, should not be confined to clinical settings. Has to happen in public at some point, and the sooner the better. Now, good enough was first used. So I talked about good enough healing in the title. The phrase good enough was first used by a very famous psychoanalyst in the 1940s or 50s to characterize most mothers. And he said that most mothers don't need to be perfect to be good enough. And I've adapted the phrase for good enough healing, because healing from the trauma of genocide will never take place in full, but it could happen in part, but has to be direct. Grieving, however, often marks the start of such healing, and it requires unfreezing and safely embracing flight and fight in a healing process. Now, this is not the jump that it may seem immediately. Richard Hovhannissian and others have noted that Armenians have long been a subject people, a position that has not fully prepared them for self-government, while others have commented that the Armenian people has not grieved its overwhelming immense losses. Richard Hovhannissian has also noted that Armenians, not all Armenians, but many Armenians and others, believe that they cannot heal until Turkey minimally acknowledges its crimes. Proposition 9, collective healing like this, which is never complete, however, depends only partially on the perpetrator's actions. Healing also depends on feeling safe enough from that perpetrator. Both acknowledgement and safety depend on I can't read that one, I'm sorry. Can someone defend on forces outside of the victim survivor group's own psyche? Next slide, please. So the last proposition, a people's psychology, that is their inner resources, is also an important factor in its fate, not only outside, but inside forces. Next slide. In the early autumn of 1917, some of the Ottoman Armenians who had earlier survived the Turks and fled to the Russian Caucasus believed that they could finally return to their homes in Eastern Turkey. At that time, the Congress of Armenian political parties met in Tiflis, Georgia, where they discussed why they had been slow to develop a national consciousness. And this is material from Richard Hovhannissian's wonderful book, The Armenian People on the Way to Independence. And he summarized the answers they gave about why they had been slow to develop a national consciousness. Nearly a millennium before, Armenians had, I can't read the whole thing. Sorry, give me a moment. I'm so sorry. Nearly a millennium before, the Armenians had lost their own tradition of governing. In contrast, he said, to the Georgians and Azeris of Transcaucasia, who were, quote, accustomed to rule and receive the patronage of the Russian government. Next. Another factor was the constant friction among them, hindered Armenian progress. Third, living for centuries under foreign lords, each more abhorrent than the other, the Armenians had come to associate government with evil. Even when presented with the opportunity to rule, they shunned the responsibility and suspected any of their own people who attempted to rise in the administrative hierarchy. Fourth, the psychology of the Armenians, in sharp contrast with that of the Georgians and Tatars, was that of a subject people. And finally, necessity had now, this is 1917, at this very terrifying, tender moment, had now reduced Armenians' focus to physical survival rather than development of a national consciousness. So I will recap the propositions in conclusion. Like individual trauma survivors, human history rhymes or repeats. Individual involuntary responses of fight, flight, and freeze, swamp are developed brains. Collectively processing situations as collective traumas could be a start on interrupting the repetition, the violent repetitions of history, or the rhymings. Many act in conformity with what is established authority in their identity groups, and traumatic threat exaggerates this widespread tendency. We are right now at a great turning point in both human and ecological history. If less compelled by trauma and conformity motivation, we can and may act deliberately, processing trauma and beginning to heal. If we develop and gain use, we can thereby develop and gain use of higher capacities for healing and liberation. But I don't know what it says there. I can't read it. 7, psychotherapeutic processes have transformed individuals' lives. Social, societal level processes offer the possibility of similar transformation. Individuals must be held accountable and deliberately confronted in trauma healing processes and elsewhere, and pressured into acting responsibly. Collective healing, which is never complete, depends only on the perpetrators, depends only partially on what the perpetrator does. And finally, the psychology of a people is an important factor in its fate, along with outside forces. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steiner. I'm now going to open the floor for questions. Please write on the chat section, and I'll ask the question to Dr. Steiner. We have a question from Alan Witherhorn. He says, thank you for a thoughtful lecture and book. In a comparative context, how well can democratic authoritarian cultures, personalities collaborate in conflict resolution towards post-traumatic outcomes?
Is it a question of comparison? I didn't hear it very clearly.
In comparative context,
okay.
How well can democratic and authoritarian cultures, personalities, collaborate in conflict resolution towards post-traumatic outcomes?
Well, it looks as though authoritarian ones have a pretty hard time doing it, but so do we, because we all face problems with trauma and we all face problems with considering new things. And we are really at a major change in history, but the only hope, I think, is with democracies. It's very hard for me to imagine authoritarian democracies getting real about any of this. But if anyone else has a contrary view, I would love to know about it. Thank you, Alan.
We have a question by Janine Economimides. I am reminded of 12-step programs and also the theories of mimetic rivalry by René Girard. Both offer a kind of transcendence of patterns of destruction and violence. I think these are possible on a collective level, at least theoretically, and with a religious component, as in 12-step programs. Neither do they depend upon others. There's a comment rather than a question here.
It's a great comment, and I personally don't. I think whether the religion has to be there is individual, but certainly whatever you consider bigger than yourself, bigger than your own interests, needs to be kept in place. And those can be principles as well as religion, I think. Religious.
Tanya B asks, Pam, in one of your slides, you mentioned embracing flight or fight after defreezing. I thought that fight or flight are also not desirable reactions, that being centered is more the goal. Did I read the slide correctly?
Right. I wonder when I said that, because by embrace, I mean that in a process of gaining understanding of yourself, once you can unfreeze and identify your emotions, because when you're frozen, you really can't speak about emotions and what your thoughts are. And they need to be, however difficult those emotions are, however difficult those thoughts are, I mean, they must be accepted by you and loved by you as you heal and as you consider them. I mean, a lot of people beat themselves up for their difficult emotions and run away from their difficult emotions and difficult thoughts. So what I mean by embrace them is to accept them and grow to love them. Because unless you do that, it's pretty hard to put them in, to get them out of running your life.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Until another person asks, I have a question. Of course, healing is important aspects in any conflict, in genocide too, as long as the perpetrator group acknowledges the fact that it was a genocide. And to a certain extent, we see some glimpses of hope. We saw some glimpses of hope in Turkey with some minor niches in Turkish leftist intellectuals, but there were also some fringe elements within the Armenian community who were also kind of open to these new gestures. But I think that we are beyond that process now, especially the Artsakh War of 2020 that reignited among the Armenians in general the fear of the past. The trauma of the past became much more ingrained within the collective psyche of the Armenians in general. This is not about the threat to use of force, but it was the use of force. Thousands of Armenians were killed soldiers defending their homeland. And so I think we are, of course, healing is important, as I said. But I think the traumatic aspect, which began with the Armenian genocide, has reignited among Armenians in general now. And I don't see this, I don't see the healing aspect is any feasible anymore, or dealing with it. It's kind of magnified the trauma now, and for a good reason, I should say.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it seems to me that it becomes actually all the more important to do the healing kind of work, because the threat is, they're terrible threats, very big ones. And the more one can work with one's thoughts and emotions and body sensations about this, the more the past can get separated from the present, so that the better quality of decision-making is available to Armenians. And I think otherwise, the people of Armenia remain very subject to the tremendous fighting between the two political parties, and must find it very hard to begin to make sense. And never has it been more important than it is now for Armenians in Armenia to make the very best possible decisions for itself in the face of this terrible stuff that, that is still, has just happened and remains a threat. So I think that the processing the past as best as possible, and it's certainly not easy in the face of current threats, but all the more important in order to enable the most grounded, thoughtful, deliberative decision-making, and to help people to come together about it too.
Of course, I mean, I'm a pessimist, so I kindly disagree. And of course, it's my right to disagree too. And I think the factor that the same actors as in the past and in the present are playing an important role in this violent, cataclysmic, cycle of violence has also distanced Armenians from any types of healing or any types of distancing themselves from the aspect of trauma. Anna Ohanian has a question.
But that's really, may I respond a little to that? Sure. Because I want to first clarify, are you talking about, when you say that Armenians have distanced themselves, are you talking about any feelings of wanting to connect better with Turks or Azerbaijanis? As Yeah, I thought so. Well, I'm talking about what Armenians, in my opinion, could do for themselves inside their own community. I'm not talking about, I mean, which I think will make them better negotiators with both Turks and Azerbaijanis. So it's very important what you said, and this is not a moment for that, but it is, from my point of view, a moment for the deepest possible self-consideration.
Thank you. Anna Ohanian has a question. Dear Pam, thank you so much for the presentation. I look forward to reading the book. What would the healing you are describing look like in a society? Does it matter if a society has rich civil society to sustain such a process? Are you envisioning dialogue groups? Just to clarify, what does collective healing look like organizationally/institutionally?
Yeah, well, this is to be invented a lot. And let me say that's not completely. And I want to mention Germany, which has done more to acknowledge what happened to Jews in the Holocaust than anyone else. And yet it hasn't healed the Jews. I want to point that out because Avraham Berg's book points out what Jewish Israelis have not done. And the same with a lot of American Jews. So Anna's question is, what would it look like? And as I had one slide in which I made a suggestion for getting it started, because it isn't easy, but I have one chapter in my book is about this, but a long chapter, the last chapter, but beginning to get in touch with your own emotions and connect them to your thoughts and conclusions and assumptions and knowledge of what happened is very important. And the healing really occurs when you connect the body emotions with it, because for an awful lot of people, they're very repressed and limit what goes on mentally or in terms of thinking. And that was very much an important point I was trying to make. And at the bigger collective, at even larger level than the work groups, but that's a start and you get used to it and you can talk about it with other people and you have to get used to that. Is to start to hold larger public meetings. I mean, I believe that the meeting held with Hassan Jamal was something of a template. And as I say, there were 200 people there. I proposed, before I wrote the book, I wrote a proposal to a very big foundation, which was interested, but they asked me for more and I decided I had to write the book when I started to write more. But my proposal was for tens of those meetings, 10 times that number of large meetings to be held in Armenia and in Turkey and Azerbaijan. I mean, I don't know how you do it in Turkey and Azerbaijan, but certainly in Armenia, but it's not an easy time, but if the Armenians in Armenia are to have a reasonable existence going forward, they will want to, and so will the ordinary Turks and Azerbaijanis over time want to be friends, presumably. I mean, presumably a lot has to happen, but there could be beginnings of connections at some point. Perhaps not yet, not until there's more settled at the diplomatic level. But anyway, I mean, it's something that I think is a great, important question and for exploration and pilot projects.
David Boyajan has a question. Dr. Steiner, can you apply your presentation to the 2020 war by 90 million strong Turkey and Azerbaijan with Israel's latest weaponry against 2 million Armenians using terrorist and other means?
I'm not sure if he's wanting to, I'm not sure what the question is, but do I condemn Israel for that? No, loudly?
No. I'm saying, can you apply your presentation, the approach that you had to the 2020 war in terms of trauma and healing?
I mean, I'm not sure still by applying it. Yes, there certainly has been widespread trauma on both sides. More on the Armenian side, without any question. And, I think that for both Turkey and Azerbaijan, which are countries which as far as I know, will not do any of this kind of work at all. Some of them may. It isn't helping their well, it's certainly, you can't even say that now. I mean, with people making friends with Turkey in ways that shouldn't be happening. So it's not a good moment.
Okay, any other questions? All right, I think we're done here. It's 7:30. We had 1 hour. Thank you very much, Dr. Steiner, for your presentation. And thank you for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research for sponsoring the Society for Armenian Studies. And we look forward reading your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.